Welcome everyone to this SIREM webinar. Hopefully you're in the right place if you're here for the Modernising the Abstraction Service webinar. So just to give a bit of an intro, so I'm Gary Stockdale. I work at Severn Trent Water. We've got a whole panel of experts here today from the EA. I'll let them introduce themselves as we kind of get on to each of their slots. But like I say, this webinar, so it's going to be an hour long. It's all around modernising the abstraction service. So certainly in terms of the role I kind of do in Severn Trent Water, so I'm involved in water resources strategy. So definitely I'll be here as chair, but also with a keen interest. So this is definitely something that my team are keen to learn about, seeing as we do all of our abstraction licenses, for example. A little bit of housekeeping just before we go as well. So this webinar is recorded, so it will go up onto SIREM's website and onto YouTube as well. So for those who want to share it afterwards, we've got Barbara who will be helping us out in the chat from SIREM. She'll be posting links to various places that we point to. So she'll be posting the links to where you can access this recording and past recordings as well. The one thing just to call out as well, there's a couple of different areas in Zoom that you can use. So there's the Zoom chat, you'll see at the bottom of your screen. So if you use that, if you've got any technical issues, that kind of thing, if you post a question in the chat, Barbara will be on hand to help you out. Barbara, like I say, will also be posting links to different places in the chat as well. And then there's also the Q&A function on Zoom, so slightly different to the chat. Again, you'll see it in a little bubble at the bottom of the screen. So if you can use that Q&A function, so any questions that you've got that you think of as we go through, you can ask as we go through whenever the question comes up, and we'll keep about 15 minutes of time at the end to work through any questions that people have as well. And one of the other things that we just wanted to ask as well is to have a think about as we go through, if there's any other areas in EA's water resources work that you'd like to know about, it'd be really great if you could post any thoughts in that. So I'll put this question in the chat so you can see it as well. But if you could post any areas that you'd like to know more about into the Q&A area, there's also an opportunity to be able to upvote those in the Q&A area as well. So we'll be able to see and kind of pinpoint which areas are getting the most focus for future webinars, for example. And then this webinar counts as 1 hour towards your CPD as well. So that was the other thing to quickly call out on housekeeping. And then just a few little bits to go through just in terms of SIREM and some upcoming events. So just again, Barbara will put this in the chat. There's the SIREM West Midlands LinkedIn group. So she will direct you to that in the chat as a place to be able to go to. There's also a new members group as well. So if anyone who's working towards SIREM chartership can join the West Midlands new members group there. One of the other things to call out, so there's a Dr. Jenkins competition that has just opened this week, I believe it is. So that's one. Again, Barbara will put some links in the chat, but that's for kind of new and prospective members, a chance to present papers on any topic around water and the environment. So that's one to take a look at. And the other one just to mention is SIREM they've made a climate and ecological, get my words out, declaration that kind of aligns to some of the arising issues that we've got around climate. It aligns to some of the upcoming COP meetings this year, and you would have seen already, and you'll see in the future as well, SIREM events kind of closely linked to some of those climate pledges and commitments that you're seeing at the moment. There's an upcoming Flood and Coast in-person event as well in Telford. That's on the 7th to the 9th of June. So that's one to take a look at. Again, Barbara will put some links in the chat, and that will be all around kind of impacts of climate change on flood and coastal erosion and the risk management around that. And there's a last chance to book onto some other events as well, which Barbara will put some links in the chat on. I feel like I'm overusing that phrase now. Just refer to the chat for links to places. So yeah, I'll hand over in a second to experts in the EA. So just in terms of the things I'll be covering, there'll be a bit of an introduction as to what environmental permitting regulation is, when it's happening, what it means, a bit of myth busting, I believe, as well, which should be interesting, covering some of that kind of digital transformation of abstraction licensing, and a bit of a local example, I think, so from the River Wye and how previously exempt abstractors are being brought into licensing control. So over to Mark, I think, yourself first to get going.
Yeah, thank you, Gary. Yeah, hi everyone. So my name's Mark Harvey. I'm a senior advisor in the national team in the Environment Agency working on digital transformation. So today we're going to talk to you about modernising the abstraction service. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of background. So at the Environment Agency, we work to create a better place for people and wildlife, and we want to support sustainable development as well. We're an executive body, a non-departmental public body sponsored by Defra. Myself and the colleagues that you'll hear from today, we work on water resources management. And just kind of rewind a little bit, a really key milestone for modernisation and reform of abstraction management was the Abstraction Plan. So this was launched a few years ago now, back in 2017, and it was supported by 3 pillars. And they were around addressing unsustainable abstraction, using our full powers, our full regulatory powers to do that, developing a stronger catchment focus, so bringing people together in catchments and kind of really focusing on that catchment-based approach. Those kind of local solutions we come up with would then help protect the environment and improve access to water. And then we've got the third part of the plan was around modernising the service, and that's one of the big themes for today's call. So making sure all significant abstractions are regulated and bringing the regulations in line with environmental permitting regimes, and also modernising the service in terms of it's a paper-based system that we operate, and we are in the kind of throes of modernising that at the moment. So as Gary said, we'll move on in a moment to Rich and Julie to talk about moving abstraction and impairment into the environmental permitting regulations. I'll then pick up the modernisation that we're doing around our water resources licensing service, and then Michelle will kind of make it real from a local kind of perspective and share what's going on around the Wye priority catchment that we've got time for those Q&A bits at the end. So I'm going to move us on to Rich and Julie. So if you'd like to introduce yourselves, and over to you guys.
Thanks, Mark. Hi everyone, my name's Richard Austin. I'm the Water Resources Manager leading on regulation. I apologise in advance for my voice and best laid plans and all that, but unfortunately I've picked up a bug. So Julie has very kindly offered to support me today, and we'll take you through some of the slides as we move through this. So we can move on to the next slide, please, Mark. We wanted to talk to you today about the process of moving abstraction and impoundment across into the environmental permitting regulation. At the moment, we regulate abstraction from a source of supply from the environment, and also impounding rivers and other sources. And we do that through a licensing system. And that's been in place since the 1960s. And it is out of date. There's no doubt about it. It's legislation that's changed very little since it was introduced. It's paper-based, and it is not fit for the way we want to regulate in the future. It sounds very simple to move across the legislative basis from licensing regime into a permitting regime, but it's actually extremely complicated, and we've already been working on this for 5 years, and there's been a huge amount of work gone into getting us to this point. But we're at the point now where we've developed the policies alongside the Defra team, and it is Defra who own the policy changes, and we're now at the point where we are preparing for implementation. So the background to all this is that way back, some of you may remember a couple of papers. There was a natural environment white paper and the case for change paper. And they set out what we wanted to do under a process called abstraction reform. It's really important for everyone to realise that what we're doing now isn't actually abstraction reform. There was a consultation document called Making the Most of Every Drop, which set out what we wanted to do in abstraction reform. Not long after that consultation took place, government decided that the priorities meant there wasn't legislative space rather to do abstraction reform, and that was things like Brexit and so on, meant that they didn't want to take this legislation through. So as Mark said, the Abstraction Plan was created, and that used secondary legislation. The secondary legislation is a statutory instrument to undertake as many of the changes as we could that were planned within the abstraction reform work. That fitted into the 25-year plan and sets out how we will achieve clean and plentiful water going forward. So one of the key parts of modernising abstraction and impoundment was to move across into the environmental permitting regulation. And that is the framework which other regimes within the Environment Agency use. So if you want to discharge to the water environment with a water discharge permit, you do that through the EPR regulations. And the same with waste and other parts of our business, you get a permit. So this work will bring us in line and give us a common regulatory framework to do most of our permitting. And abstraction and impoundment was the biggest regime in the organisation. It wasn't currently under the EPR regulations. So when we started this work, we had some ministerial direction, and that was to move across to the environmental permitting regulations without changing, or with as little change as possible, to existing licence holders' rights. And that was key, and that's really set the direction for how we've gone about doing this work. The second thing was there was a ministerial decision made that we would do this separately in England and Wales. Up until now, we've had common legislative basis for abstraction and impoundment, so the licensing regime was built on England and Wales legislation. For the first time, we will be splitting apart that legislation, and we are moving ahead with the move to EPR. Wales are looking at doing that as well, but they aren't ready to do that in the same time frame. So they will look to move across into the EPR at a later date. There was a Defra-led consultation on the policy proposals for the move to EPR, which took place last autumn and closed last December. And that set out the policy decision on which the basis to move to the EPR were being set. Move to the next slide, please, Mark. So consultation responses, we received 109 consultation responses to that Defra consultation. We got responses from across all sectors impacted by this. So that's everyone who currently has an abstraction or impoundment licensing. That includes water companies, industry, agriculture, aquaculture, power generation. We got some really good responses from across the board. And many of those responses were very detailed because this is very complex. The SI document, the statutory instrument document that is being drafted by Defra lawyers, is a huge document that will set out how we will make the legislative changes. And our role in the Environment Agency has been to provide the technical expertise to support Defra in making those policy decisions and developing that statutory instrument. So with our support, Defra are considering the responses to the consultation document. And they're going to produce a government response document in the summer that will set out any changes that they want to make to the policies as a result of that consultation. I'm going to hand over to Julie now to talk about a little bit about what we're actually proposing. Move on to the next slide, please.
Hello, everybody. So I'm Julie Turton, and I work for Richard in our national team, and I've been the project lead for this move for the last 5 years. So as Richard has talked about then, I suppose in terms of some of the myths, the move that we're making is very much about getting the regulation of abstraction and impoundment into EPR. And it's about bringing regulations in line with those other environmental permitting regimes. It does look to make full use of existing regulatory powers, and it is not an opportunity to assess anybody's existing license or to change anybody's conditions or to bring in any of these new powers. To do that, we would have needed the primary legislation. So as the consultation set out, as I'm sure many of you have seen, we are proposing to adopt the provisions of the environmental permitting regulations as far as possible for abstraction and impounding activities so that there continues to be one consistent regulatory regime. What that does mean is that we've had to tweak some of the provisions that are in EPR, and we've had to write some new ones specifically for abstraction and impounding activities. And this is because some of the fundamental principles that protect abstractors and the environment are specific to water resources legislation, and they're not currently found in the environmental permitting regulations, which historically have been around those regimes which either store something or put something into the environment. So we've also proposed to move parts of the existing legislation over into the EPR to keep those provisions which are essential for water resources management. So what we will do is we will take our existing licenses with us, and we're not going to change those as we move into EPR. They'll be known as converted abstraction permits or converted impounding permits. And we'll have those permits, which we will call permits, and they are our old licensing stock. And then once we're in the EPR, what we'll start to do is issue permits under those new environmental permitting regulations. So we'll have converted permits, which are our old licensing stock, and then we'll have the permits that are actually issued under EPR. And there are transitional regulations which will allow existing license holders to keep operating in the way that they currently do and retain things like compensation rights and the conditions that people abstract under now. Anyone that has an existing license with a time limit, those time limits will run until expiry. And another element of the process are the new authorizations. So one part of the abstraction plan around modernising abstraction was bringing in exempt abstractions into regulation, which are known as new authorizations. One of the reasons for us moving to EPR next year is so that all new authorizations could be issued as licenses under the current legislation. Therefore, they'll be issued as licenses with time limits. And again, those time limits will run until expiry. And on day one, we will begin to adopt the new regulations as set out in that statutory instrument. All new and amended or transferred permits will all be determined under the environmental permitting regulations, and this does include some new provisions which we don't currently have in abstraction and impounding licensing, such as the operator and the management condition. Can you move us on, please, Mark? So, moving into the EPR, that gives us our regulatory framework, and it will underpin everything that we do in water resources. We will use it to issue permissions. It will, the Environment Agency will still regulate abstraction and impounding. We'll still do that with a permission, but it'll just be a different permission. It will be a permit instead of a license. And as part of the move, we are not reissuing any documentation. And this underlines our commitment to not change any of the licenses or the conditions as we move into environmental permitting. What doesn't change are the mechanics of how the Environment Agency manage water resources. So things that you will have heard in terms of the CAMS process, abstraction licensing strategies, water availability, environmental protection, all those things will remain the same. It's as though we've taken that top layer, that regulatory framework, the permitting and the compliance, that's the bit that changes. That underlying, the things that we still do as the Environment Agency to manage water resources, that will stay the same. But having worked in both abstraction licensing and learning about environmental permitting and being involved in developing those regulations, it is a mindset shift. We're moving towards site-based regulation, and that's done in a catchment context, but it does bring in some differences. So on to the next slide, please, Mark. And these are just some of the key things that will change and that's different as we move into environmental permitting. So at the moment, we have license types. We can have one of 3 abstraction licenses, a full, a transfer, or a temporary license, and we also have impounding licenses. As we move into the EPR, we will have activities. So there will be a water abstraction activity and a water impounding activity. We also propose to change the current groundwater investigation consent into a permitted activity, and this will be known as a groundwater investigation abstraction activity. At the moment, you can have a license which has 1 activity on it, so it might be a license for a full abstraction, for example, and you can have a license for a single source of supply. Thinking about this site-based regulation, what we want to do is change that and expand that so that a permit can have multiple activities. So this reverses the position taken in the 2003 Water Act, and it can have more than 1 source of supply. So if you think about an agricultural example, for, just as an example, there may be 3 or 4 abstractions on there, maybe 2 different surface water supplies, 1 different groundwater supplies. All of those could be on the same permit. It's exactly the same for something like a hydropower, where the full abstraction activity, a transfer abstraction activity, and a water impounding activity could all be on the same permit. And one of the big things and the big differences about EPR is that there'll be no more time limits. So permits are not time limited. Instead, the Environment Agency will have to periodically review all their permits. And this is all the permits, so it's both those permits that have come across into EPR and it's the new ones that we will issue under the EPR. There is a lot of alignment in terms of those processes which were already in the environmental permitting regulations. So things like variations, appeals, advertising. We've tried to align with those as much as possible, particularly throughout the core regulations, to bring that consistent framework. And there are some additional enforcement powers in the EPR which we propose to adopt. I think particularly the new one for us is the Regulation 37 suspension power. But we're also proposing to carry across some of our existing enforcement powers and our civil sanctions. Do we want to move on, Mark? So in terms of the legislative next steps, these are the things that Defra take the lead on. As Richard mentioned, the consultation closed on the 22nd of December. If anybody, if you want to look at the consultation document and any of the supporting annexes, it is still available on the Defra Citizen Space page. Defra are now reviewing the responses, and that government response is expected in the summer. Following the government response, the statutory instrument will be finalised, and then it will begin the process of laying in the autumn, with implementation expected at some point in 2023. And Defra's email account is there on the bottom if you want to know more about that process. So in terms of the Environment Agency's next steps, as Richard alluded to, we are now moving into the implementation phase. So we need to now think about developing that guidance and those technical supporting documents that sit alongside the regulations. And we're going to do that working closely with our external advisory group. The group have been with us now for over 3 years. and they've really helped us to shape some of those key policy proposals that went into the consultation. And the expectation is that that group now helps shape the implementation work going forward. And as a flavour of what some of that is, things like the operator guidance, the permit review process, and how we can adopt the management systems for abstraction and impounding activities. We also need to train our teams ready for implementation, and this is across the business. So from our permitting centre right through to area operations and our national colleagues. And we need to develop our communications for existing licence holders so that we can prepare them for transition. And this is all about informing them of the steps that they'll need to take and things that will happen in the run-up to the move to EPR for when the regulations change, because there's a window of time where things like existing applications, things that are in the system, the Environment Agency will need to manage that, because as we move into the EPR and we pick up those new regulations, we start using those regulations from day one. So we need to get that transition pathway right and those communications right for our existing licence holders. And as Mark will talk about, I'm sure, we also need to make changes to our IT systems to move from abstraction licensing into the new world of environmental permitting.
Super. Thank you, Julie. A perfect link across to the digital work that we're doing. So what am I going to cover today in terms of our digital work? So I'm going to talk about the water resource licensing service and how it can help abstractors manage their water abstraction license. I'll talk about new water abstraction e-alerts and how they can help abstractors maximise opportunities to access water. And then finally, if you hold an abstraction license, how to register. It's really straightforward. So why is this water resource licensing service? So it's an online system on gov.uk. It allows licence holders or their agents, they can register for the service and they can view their abstraction licences online, submit their abstraction returns online, view their returns online. It helps us manage charging in the Environment Agency, and we will be using it increasingly now for water abstraction alerts, which help us manage hands-off flow conditions and hands-off level conditions. So I'll come over to those and explain them in a moment. But why do we need it? So we've heard kind of snippets of this already about, you know, we're operating a system that started in the 1960s. So we need to modernise, make a step change in the way we manage and allocate water. We've heard about the Abstraction Plan and environmental permitting regulations. So we need to enable and implement that government policy. And it just makes us more efficient as well. We can make savings in the way that we work, but we can also improve access to water, and there's huge benefits for the economy and society by doing that. And we want to innovate as well. We want to make better use of the data that we've got and just improve the way we manage water resources. So what does the service look like? So this is just a couple of screenshots of the service. The one on the left is what you see when you log in as a license holder. So you can see your license number or license numbers on there. And then on the right hand side of the screen, a kind of shot of some of the details that you can see about period of abstraction, some of the quantities that are the amounts that are on the license there. And you'll see that that's all, if you've applied to change your driving license recently, or done any of those kind of government transactional things, you'll see it's really familiar. So the service sits on gov.uk, as you can see there. It's been in existence since March 2018, and it's a secure system. You know, license holders have to register to be able to see their license information. And I talked earlier about the benefits. So we've calculated some of the benefits for economy and society, potentially are massive. So improved access to water rights through enhanced trading. Over 25 years, that could amount to £100 million. You know, huge sums of money. The way that we've allowed abstractors to submit their returns online rather than through bits of paper that could save £300,000 per year. And then some stuff there I'll talk about in a minute, about £13.7 million a year for more rapid notifications around water abstraction alerts. But there's also benefits for the Environment Agency. So I think it's important that we can demonstrate that we're cost effective in the way that we're doing our digital work. So I've just put a flavour of some of the savings that we can make in there. So we've got this service, it's in place, and it's growing all the time. So we've got plans to grow the service, and there's two main areas that we're looking at. The first one is about improving access to water, and the second area is around permitting. So in terms of improving access to water, I'll talk about the abstraction e-alerts in a moment, but we want to be able to allow abstractors to go on and see live flow and river level and groundwater. So yeah, river flow data and groundwater level information for their abstraction licenses, so they can see what's going on in their local area, and also to send SMS or text reminders with these water abstraction alerts. So they could, as an option, they can get a reminder. And then in terms of permitting, so when we introduce environmental permitting, we're planning to be able to allow abstractors to apply for any new abstraction permits online. So a truly online permit application process and a public register to go with that as well. So lots of ideas that we want to make there to improve the service that we've got, and it will only grow. So water abstraction e-alerts. So around about 3,500 abstraction licenses in England have got something called a hands-off condition. So this is a condition that we put onto licenses. So when the river flow or the groundwater level reduces to a certain threshold, we stop or reduce abstraction to protect the environment and the rights of other abstractors. So a really important condition. We already use the water resource licensing service in some of our areas to post alerts to abstractors to say that the threshold has been crossed or is about to be crossed. And we're expanding that feature so that we'll be able to email water abstraction alerts to our abstractors. And our area of teams use a variety of different ways to manage these hands-off conditions, including phone systems and local email systems. And over time, we want to move to these abstraction alerts from the water resource licensing service. So abstractors have told us that they want better and more consistent ways of finding out whether or not their hands-off conditions are enforced. And we also think these alerts will be a really important part in helping abstractors adapt to climate change. So as river and groundwater levels fluctuate with climate change, and allow abstractors to be in sync with the available water resources rather than waiting for post alerts, which is slower and therefore not always up to date. We've also tested the wording on the alerts extensively with abstractors and with our staff as well, to make sure they're really clear and understandable. That's really important. And if a license holder signs up for these email alerts, then they can receive multiple alerts. So a tenant could receive the alert as well as the license holder, for example. Whereas with the letter, we can only send those letters to the license holder. So there's far more flexibility, as you imagine, with an e-alert. So when are these things going to happen? So we're phasing these in from April this year. So we're going to contact license holders. Our local Environment Agency teams will contact license holders to offer e-alerts, so we can ensure a smooth transition from the current system across to the water resource licensing service. So if you're in our East Midlands or Lincolnshire and Northamptonshire areas, you may already have been contacted, for example, by the local team. But if not, please be patient. You will hear from your local team in due course. So the existing processes that we use around water abstraction alerts in, for example, East Anglia and other parts of West Midlands as well, include a phone system. So that's quite a big change to move from a phone system to water abstraction e-alerts, for example. So we've got to carefully consider the transition that we make between those two. And in some cases, license holders might want to receive a postal alert that may suit them. They might have email. or there may be very specific wording in some of their license conditions, which prevents us emailing alerts. But by agreement, we can look to amend that. So I talked earlier about the benefits of these water abstraction alerts, these e-alerts. I mean, don't worry about the detail in this slide too much, but it just shows the benefit of email alerts over postal alerts. So if we post an alert, we have to make a judgment call on what the flow will do and what the weather's doing and how much abstraction is taking place. And if we post an alert, we have to make a judgment call on all those kind of factors, whereas email alerts allow us to send that alert immediately, so we can better reflect the prevailing conditions, and that means that we can improve access to water. So using figures from the National Farmers Union, we estimate an annual benefit of up to £13.7 million for the economy and society for more rapid notifications, improving access to water as these flows and levels recover. So this is really big, important stuff. So moving on to my final slide now. So why should I register? So if you hold an abstraction license in England, you can save time and money by submitting your records of actual abstraction online, and you can view and check your license details and reduce the risk of non-compliance by understanding what your license allows you to do. And as I said earlier, the service will only grow in the future, so there will be more benefits for you. And in terms of water abstraction alerts, they really will maximise the opportunities to access water when it's available. So providing your email address to us when we contact you is a really important step. So I'd urge you to do that. So I'm going to finish that now, and I'm going to hand across to Michelle, and she's going to talk to you more about priority catchment work in the Wye. So Michelle, over to you.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, so I'm Michelle Morris, and I'm a catchment planner in the integrated environment planning team in the West Midlands, and I'm also lead for the priority catchment initiative in the Wye. Next slide, please, Mark. So, yep, priority catchments. It's a national initiative, and they were introduced to deliver a catchment approach. Developing a stronger catchment focus is a big part of the abstraction plan, and we know that we need to have a good understanding of the issues locally, so we need to engage locally. And to do that, 10 catchments were identified throughout England, and the locations are there on the map. All of these catchments had an unmet demand for water, but was also recognised there was a potential there to perhaps use some new and innovative techniques to see where we could meet that demand. And all of these catchments are known as priority catchments. There's a link also to our citizen space page, which gives a little bit more detail about some of the work that's going on in the other priority catchments. So the Wye in the West Midlands was selected as a priority catchment. So next slide, please. We nominated the Wye because it's one of our cross-border catchments. It sits on the border between England and Wales. So we work closely with our colleagues in Natural Resources Wales to make sure we've got a consistent approach for abstractors. But this priority catchment initiative gives us the opportunity to sort of tease out some of those differences in policy and just ways of working, really. Another layer of complexity to the Wye catchment is that the River Wye itself is a designated special area for conservation, or SAC, and some of its tributaries are SSIs. So we need to work closely with Natural England, and we do so to agree and set targets, flow targets, in order to protect the ecological status of the river. The catchment is a rural catchment, and we find that high-grade agricultural land frequently experiences flooding during the winter, whereas in the summer months, water availability is quite often restricted. And we know from climate change predictions that these indicate that flow and rainfall will reduce in the summer months when abstraction demand is likely to be at its highest. whereas rainfall will be heavier and flows higher in the winter months, possibly leading to more widespread flooding. There's high demand for water in the catchment, and our concerns are that in order to protect the ecological status of the river, we need to take steps to improve access, otherwise we're not going to meet that demand. Next slide, please. So the current water use in the English side of the Wye at the moment, public water supply accounts for about 70% of the total licence volume, and our water companies hold about 11 licences, take around 40 million cubic metres a year. Our second biggest user is agriculture, and they take around 8 million cubic metres a year, mainly for spray and trickle irrigation. Horticulture is quite typical in certain parts of the catchment, and the main source of supply is trickle irrigation. Now this activity, trickle irrigation, was previously exempt from licensing, but this has been recently brought into the licensing regime, known as the new authorisations process that Julie mentioned. And this process has given us the opportunity to assess the impact of those abstractions in line with what we need to achieve for the Wye SAC, and we can consider a more restrictive hands-off flow condition if appropriate. And last year we issued 63 of these new authorisations, all with an appropriate hands-off flow condition or relevant screening requirements. Next slide, please. Yes, so Mark's already talked about the water availability alerts and mentioned the different ways that our abstractors receive those. And in the West Midlands, it's no different. Mainly our abstractors will receive those letters by email, sorry. Sometimes they get that letter emailed, or we have phone services. It just depends on the catchment. In the Wye, they use a phone line service called Spray Line, and that's used by both our Welsh and English abstractors. So this year, part of the Priority Catchment Initiative, we're going to be trialling sending those water availability alerts by email. That's hoping to start in April this year. Towards the end of the year, we'll gather some feedback and then start our discussions with Natural Resources Wales as to the future of water availability alerts in the catchment. Next slide, please. So at the beginning of the Priority Catchment project, we engaged with our abstractors and our partners that have a water resources interest in the catchment to look at some of the key topics around the challenges and opportunities that might be in the catchment. Not surprisingly, one of the biggest topics was around water storage. So it was around taking advantage of those high flows for abstraction, and also rainwater harvesting and storing these typically in sort of on-farm storage reservoirs for use later in the season when water availability might be restricted. The second area was around opportunities for multiple benefit projects, such as working with natural processes. For example, if we're holding water back in the catchment to slow the flow and reduce downstream flooding, then we can also reduce runoff, so we're improving water quality. But if these are done in the right areas, then they can also recharge groundwater and improve soil infiltration. And then the third topic was around looking at opportunities for water sharing in the catchment. Water sharing is a much more informal process, which doesn't require any licence changes. So that's sort of how it differs to water trading if for those of you that are familiar with water trading. We know that Cranfield University had worked in a priority catchment in East Anglia, looking at opportunities for water sharing with the agricultural businesses. So we were lucky enough to secure some funding for Cranfield University students to look at some opportunities for us in the Wye catchment as well. Next slide, please, Mark. Yes, so we've got Cranfield University MSc students that are going to be looking at opportunities for improving abstraction resilience to drought in the River Wye catchment. They're going to be surveying our agricultural abstractors and then analysing all of our licence data. And then from that, they'll put forward some opportunities and options that we might be able to take forward to improve access to water. And this includes looking at the water sharing approach and whether or not that will be a meaningful option for abstractors in the Wye. My last slide then, please, Mark. So yeah, this priority catchment initiative has given us a good opportunity to sort of delve a lot deeper into those water resources issues in the catchment. We've been able to republish the Wye abstraction licensing strategy along with an appendix which sets out our future approach, our future catchment approach. The project findings from the Cranfield University study will show us where we need to focus our future work. And then we can start having those conversations with abstractors and partners in the catchment to make sure that water resources is part of that ongoing catchment-based approach. And then it's a case of improving and maintaining that catchment approach to make sure that that's ongoing in the Wye, and what lessons we can learn from that to roll this out for the rest of the West Midlands.
So you all finished, Michelle?
Yeah, thank you.
Real super. There's definitely, just to check, no one else is speaking, am I, before I jump straight into questions?
Go for it, Gary.
No,
well done.
Super. So no, thank you very much, Michelle. Thanks everyone. That was some really interesting topics. So we've got about 10 minutes left. So I'm going to jump straight into questions because there's been a few, which is great. So all the panelists, you've obviously done a great job because you sparked lots of interest. And Mark, I've seen you've been diligently answering some of the questions as well, which is great. So I will focus on the ones that haven't been answered for now. So first one up then, there was one from Dan around, why is EPR being separated out between England and Wales?
Yeah, so I'll pick that one up. The answer is that it's two different governments working to two different timescales. So the minister in England couldn't stand up and make promises for what could happen in Wales and vice versa. So the decision was taken to separate the two out. And although we are working together, try and make sure that we are as common as we can be across the border in future, it does mean that for a short while we will be working in different legislative regimes. And even when we've moved to the EPR, it may not be the same in both England and Wales, depending on how Wales want to approach it. So it was a government decision to split it across the border, and Welsh government will direct the Welsh team to do what they need to in order to implement what they want.
Well, thank you, Rich. Okay, next one then. So there was one around, so are there licenses that don't have time limits? And what's the kind of difference between permits and licenses as well?
Yeah, so again, I can pick this one up. So time limits were introduced in the 1990s. So there are some licenses that were issued before that don't have time limits. So they don't have any review date built into them. But actually, this leads very nicely into Dan's question about the difference between time limits and periodic reviews. So we've got some licenses that have time limits, some that don't, and that's really down to when they were issued and the availability of water at the time. The reason for a time limit is that it gives us a review point at which we can review that license, make sure that it's still sustainable. And if not, we've got an opportunity to address that with the license holder. Actually, what we do is we review all abstraction licenses every 6 years on a rolling 6-year process. And what we do is that we assess whether the licenses are sustainable or not in any particular catchment. If we find that they aren't sustainable, then we move on to looking at the mechanisms available to make them sustainable. That's outside of the process of EPR. So the periodic review is just another name for the work we already do to review catchments on a 6-year basis and to look at whether licenses are sustainable or not. And time limits can be for 6 or 12 years, they can be longer, and we have got some really long duration time limited licenses. But under EPR, you will have an ongoing permit until the review finds that there is something that needs to do because that permit is no longer sustainable. And that's against the legislative drivers such as the Water Framework Directive or the Habitat Directive. And obviously they've now been translated into UK.
Real, thanks, Rich. So I think you're probably just touching on, there's a couple of questions I think from Dan and Dominique that I think they're asking the same thing and interlinked, and you're just starting to touch on it, Rich, around the kind of difference between time limits and periodic reviews. What's the advantage of periodic reviews? How regular will they be? Sorry, that's 3 questions in one go, isn't it?
So the advantage of time limited reviews, we do it now anyway. So it's something we already do. Under the EPR, there is a statutory duty to review permits. And so we have to have a process to do that. And that's going to be called the permit review. So it's something we already do. The advantage of not having time limits is that the abstractor doesn't have to renew them every 6 or 12 years or 18 years, however long their time limited permit is. And every time the abstractor has to renew their license, they have to pay to do that. So we're removing that administrative and cost burden on the abstractor who has a time limited license, so that once they've got a permit, they don't have to be renewing it. It's theirs until we find that the catchment is unsustainable for some reason. And then we will have to look at how we address that unsustainability. But that unsustainability isn't part of the move to EPR. We would do that anyway now, and we have mechanisms to do that. It's just a new name for what we do at the moment to assess the sustainability of any particular catchment.
Cool. Thank you, Rich. Okay, moving on to the next one then. So there was one around, I'd like to know the distance between 2 businesses. So for example, 2 agri-businesses, or what distance is considered during a water sharing project. So I think they were then given the example, like what's the possible distance between 2 abstraction points that would likely be approved for a water sharing project?
So this again is one of those where there isn't a set rule. It's down to where the abstraction is taking place. And obviously our licenses will look at the abstraction proposal and look at whether the proposal is sustainable and the merits of the proposal being put forward. So it would be very much a case by case basis. But Michelle, I don't know if you've got any experience of that from your work.
Yeah, so what we're hoping, Cranfield University have, with their previous work in East Anglia, have put together something that they called Operalisation, which basically sort of colour codes, gives a sort of traffic light system as to whether or not water sharing is likely to be sort of meaningful for abstractors. So that's what we're hoping that they'll do in the Wye. So they'll colour coded it based on whether those licenses are sort of neighbouring farms, how close they are, what the WFD, the Water Framework Directive status of that brook is, whether or not we're likely to approve the process. So they'll be looking at all those sort of intricate ways. And then hopefully from that, we might have some guidance really for how we take it forward in the Wye.
Very well, thanks, Michelle. Thanks, Rich. So, Michelle, this might be another one for you potentially. There's one around the implications for nutrient neutrality in the Wye catchment.
Yeah, so I think it's a big issue at the moment. We have a nutrient management board that meets to discuss this, and we've got a phosphate action plan as well that this all ties into. A lot of the new authorisations that were issued last year, they will have been modelled. New modelling was done in order to sort of set those new hands-off flow conditions. I suppose I could take that away and get a better answer as well, if that's okay.
Sure, that's fine. I did check, didn't I, before we joined? So I know there's lots of questions coming in. We might not get a chance to get through all of them, but we did say I'm not putting my foot in it here. I don't think, because we checked, but we said we'd be able to take any questions that were unanswered away. So that's one can take away, perhaps, Michelle, as well. But no, that's great.
Great, thanks.
Real. So there was another one then from Stuart. So Stuart's talking about the fact, it's really interesting actually. So undertaking Britain's longest canal restoration project. So it's restoring biodiversity, wildlife corridors, that kind of thing. I think he was saying essentially there's a section that's been shovel ready for a number of years, and it's faced some kind of additional EA requirements. So the question was, will this new abstraction policy benefit wildlife and people in perhaps a better way to what we might have had in the past?
Yeah, I can have a crack at this one. So the move to the EPR doesn't really change anything, as Julie said, in the way that we assess availability of water. And I think what Stuart's saying there is that there are issues with that shovel-ready section and providing water to it and filling it. And by moving to the EPR, we won't be changing the way we assess whether water is available for abstraction, how much water there is, and how much the environment needs, and whether existing abstraction already has taken up the available amount of water in any particular catchment. So move to the EPR and the work that we're doing won't change that. However, some of the other work that's going on within the Environment Agency, work on the regional plans that are being developed across the country, looking at how we can make water available in different parts of the country through the national framework. Those might be opportunities where water can be moved around the country in order to make it available in different places. But the things that we're talking about today won't actually make that difference to that.
Brilliant, thanks, Rich. So I'm conscious we're just run over time. Maybe we do one more question, maybe, because we started a few minutes late, if that's okay. And then, like I say, we'll be able to pick up the other questions offline. So sorry if we didn't get to yours. I'm being fair, going down the list. The last one then from Steve was just around, is there any documentation that indicates the criteria that will be used as part of the proposed annual periodic review? So for example, what would sectors be judged against?
Yeah, so we have guidance now for assessing whether time-limited licenses are sustainable, and that will form the basis of our discussions around what the periodic review will cover. But I think, as Julie said, the key thing for the periodic review is it's one of the things that we'll be working on over the next 18 months. It's what we will be working on very closely with the external advisory group to make sure that we are retaining the best bits of the current approach, improving it where we can, but also making sure we aren't introducing any unintended consequences. Because with something like this, there is, it would be very easy to accidentally introduce an additional burden, something that was unfair. And that's not the intention, because as Julie said, we want to try and, we've been given the direction to keep things similar as we have at present. So we'll be developing our guidance around things like permit review and other parts of the EPR over the next 18 months. And they will be made available, as Julie said, through the comms process ahead of the move into the EPR.
Real. Super. Thank you, Rich. Right, I think we've gone over a little bit, so I'll call it there. It's just to say thanks very much to West Midlands SIWEM and Barbara, who's on the line and diligently set all of this up and posting links in the chat. So the kind of unsung heroes. Definitely thank you very much, Barbara, for that. And then yeah, thanks Michelle, Mark, Rich and Julie as well for all of the really interesting topics and answering all those questions as well. We'll take some of the questions away. And like I said at the start, we'll I think the link to this recording will be in the chat. It will be on SIWEM's YouTube if you want to point anyone to visit it who wasn't able to make it. But we'll leave it there. So thank you very much, everyone.